Governors across PJM are raising questions about the future of the grid, rising energy costs, and how well the system is working for consumers. Last week, they held a conference in Philadelphia to delve into these questions. You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we unpack the stories and trends behind America's power grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, President and CEO of EPSA. Headlines from the conference have focused on the governor's remarks and debates about a crisis in confidence in how PJM is run and operated, as well as questions about whether states will leave the market or should turn to regulated utilities to once again own and operate power plants. But as today's discussion will show, the real story goes deeper, and there's a lot that consumers need to know about what really drives their electric bills. We're entering a period of unprecedented load growth from data centers, electrification, and a rapidly expanding economy. For years, PJM operated with excess supply, which allowed some to downplay the need for durable market constructs. That era is over. Now, capacity markets and PJM as a whole are being blamed for higher bills, even though they've actually helped keep total consumer costs relatively stable compared to other regions. In this episode, I sit down with 4 panelists who participated in the conference to unpack what they heard, as well as takeaways and the pathway forward. We also break down why markets remain the best path forward and push back on some of the narratives around energy prices, utilities, and what's really needed to increase supply. My guests represent some of EPSA's member companies and are leading experts in competitive power generation and market design, as well as PJM and its governance. Travis Kavulla is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at NRG and a former chairman of the Montana Public Service Commission. Marji Phillips is the Senior Vice President of Wholesale Market Power at LS Power. Arnie Quinn is the Senior Vice President of Regulatory Policy at Vistra Corp. And former Director of the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation, the Division of Economic and Technical Analysis, and the Division of Energy Market Oversight at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And finally, Glen Thomas is President of PJM Power Providers Group and the former Chairman of the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission. He also served on the staff of Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge and as an advisor to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. LS, NRG, and Vistra are some of the largest competitive power companies in the United States, providing thousands of megawatts of electric power generation from resources of all kinds. The PJM Power Providers Group, or P3, represents competitive power generators serving the PJM region. Together, they explore market governance, the role of capacity markets, and how to strike the right balance between state and federal roles. We also dig into the challenges of securing reliability, improving load forecasting, and the growing impact of AI-driven demand on the grid. Here's our conversation. Before we get started, I want to welcome our guests and give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves so that our listeners can connect voices to names.
Hi, this is Travis Kavulla, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for NRG Energy. Hi, Todd. Thanks for having
Travis.
me.
Thanks, Todd, for having me. It's Marji Phillips. I'm with LS Power, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Wholesale Market Policy.
Thanks, Marji.
Hi, Todd. This is Arnie Quinn. I'm Senior Vice President of Regulatory Policy for Vistra. Thanks for having me today.
You bet.
Yeah, and this is Glen Thomas, President of GT Power Group. Thanks for having me, Todd.
You bet, Glenn. Thanks for joining us. Last week, there was a governor's conference addressing questions around PJM, governance, operations, and the issues that are impacting consumers all across the PJM footprint. And the governor's conference drew wide media attention, headlines about surging power bills, a crisis of confidence in PJM governance, and any number of other criticisms were leveled. But I'm curious, from each of your perspectives as panelists that participated, what did you take away from the tone of the summit? And beneath the rhetoric, was there any real challenges that you think we ought to be focusing on in reality as opposed to perhaps some of the rhetoric? Marji?
Sure. I thought it was interesting that everyone on our panel, and I was on the Are the Markets Working kind of panel, I think we all agreed that they have worked and they can work, but there is a uniform concern about the unanticipated significant amount of megawatts coming on the system because of data centers, and then the fact that there's going to be a cost allocation problem because that demand is going to cause prices to go up because we don't yet have the supply to meet it. So I thought it was a constructive conversation once the politics took second place.
I thought there was a good amount of consensus that there are a few things that we should probably do in the near term. We do need a better handle on the load forecast. We need a much better sense of how big is this problem. If we could do something with the interconnection process, probably both the load and the generator interconnection process, I think that would give us a better sense of how many resources really can come on and how quickly can they come on. And so I think once you have a better sense of what the load is, and once you have a better sense of what the new supply is, then you have a much better picture of how serious is this problem. I think we're going to learn that it is something that we need to stay focused on, but it is not a crisis. It is not the end of the world, and it's not something that's not manageable.
Thanks, Arnie.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Todd, again, first of all, tip of the hat to the governors for organizing this conversation. I thought it was a very helpful and engaging conversation to see that many people gathered in one room, representatives from all the commissions in the PJM footprint gathered together to talk about these really important issues. I just think is just remarkable in and of itself. I'm not sure there has been a gathering that big of folks just talking about PJM issues, and it's because of the governors they were able to assemble that. And I also agree with Arnie that I think there were some very constructive observations that were offered and some takeaways that can be acted on. And load forecasting is certainly at the top of that list. There's two sides of this equation. There's a supply side and there's a demand side. There's been a lot of conversation about whether the supply side is up for the challenge, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that it is. But there's also some serious questions on the demand side about whether we're accurately predicting what is indeed likely to come on the system. And not only the volume of what's coming on the system, but how it's coming on the system and how it can be best integrated. So I think it's certainly time to roll up our sleeves and do some work in that area.
Yeah, it helps to have an accurate target, right, that we're aiming for. If we're shooting at nothing, we're sure to miss. So a lot of the conversation that we heard from some of the panelists and some of the governor's staff was that PJM's not responding fast enough to demand and price pressure and the cost implications, of course, that Marji noted a moment ago. But do you think giving states a greater or a more formal role in the process actually solves any of these issues, or does it just create a new level of uncertainty or new risks?
Having states engaged is important, right? I mean, states have a huge role in this. PJM has always recognized that. And over the years, PJM has expanded not only its staff to support state relations, but its engagement with the states. We're going to be going to the OPSI meeting next week and doing nothing but talking about issues related to PJM with state policymakers. So state engagement is, at the end of the day, a positive thing. But also, governance matters. And at the end of the day, PJM is a public utility with an independent board of directors that is regulated by FERC. And it's important for states and the stakeholder body to be feeding the board and informing the board and providing appropriate advice and counsel to the board. It's important for the board to make decisions that are in the best interest of the market and sending those decisions to FERC for them to deliberate and ultimately determine if those paths are just and reasonable.
I would add that I think there is a large role for state regulators, governors, commissioners to play going forward. I'm a little disappointed that there's so much finger pointing instead of focusing how we can cooperate going forward. But while PJM is the federal entity that is telling us what the wholesale price to build a new power plant is, the retail regulators have so much jurisdiction to run with that. They permit the load, they permit the generators. If they want to put obligations on either, they can do so, and they control retail rates. So if they want to create different class rates with a concern on cost allocation, they can do that. So I agree with Glen. It's really important we coordinate, but at the same time, both federal and state regulators have really important jobs to do to make this work.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I recognize that the states can file comments and be active at FERC, the federal regulator. So it does make a lot of sense to try to get them coordinated and part of the solution development process on the front end, along with all the other stakeholders. One other thing I'd add, though, is I've always thought of the capacity market as being that thing that makes sure that everyone is doing their fair share. And when everyone decides that they're going to lean on the system, then prices are going to go up. And if we have political actors trying to prevent that from happening so that the decisions that have been made are not reflected in the prices that will drive the solution to that shortage, then I start to become worried. So that role for the political actor is there to feed the process, but not to distort it.
Thanks, Arnie. That's helpful. So there was some discussion around re-reg or utility ownership, utility rate basing of new generation. Several of you were on the panel that talked about resource adequacy. Would re-reg or allowing utilities to build new gen actually lower bills, as some of the folks argued? Or does that look like it would actually backfire on consumers?
Well, Todd, I can take a stab at this. You're talking to an old dog who watched PJM go to this sort of deregulation. And I think everybody conceded that being part of a regional organization lowers prices. There is no reason to think that won't continue. And I think that the biggest demonstration of that is that PJM had a special process to try and get more generation online faster. And the response to it was incredible. There were about 26,000 megawatts bid in. I can't remember exactly how many cleared. I know my company bid in 700 megawatts at $1 billion. And the point is, if a utility has an RFP, at most they can maybe get one or two to land on their balance sheet, and the customers then take up the risk of the performance of that power plant. And at the end of the day, that technology can become very obsolete, and the utility has rate-based it and stuck customers with it for 20 years. When you rely on the PJM market to drive new investment, the investors take the risk. And if their technology becomes obsolete or prices go down, consumers don't bear that risk. I think that regulators still appreciate that. But it's like everybody, all corporations are looking to grow their share of the business. So it would make sense that utilities want to get back into a business that they perceive has a lot of growth opportunity.
Sure. Who could blame them, right?
Yep. And let me build on that. I think in this moment, when we're talking about the uncertainty around the load forecast, I don't think anyone is saying that significant new load isn't coming. It is. But is it 30 gigawatts by 2030 that PJM talks about? Is it some lower number like 24 gigawatts? Is it a bigger number? In a world where we're not highly confident in how much new demand is coming, a world where you're insulated from guessing too high, and that's exactly what the utilities are. If they guess too high, they're still going to get paid. They're still going to recover costs. I think it's especially important that we rely more on the competitive supplier, where we will absolutely respond to the needs of our customers, new and existing, but we're not going to respond until we have a level of confidence that new customers are going to come. And the utilities just don't operate with the same frame of mind.
Yeah, maybe to drill down on that point a little bit more. As I said, I sat there at the conference and I think I heard 7 or 8 different versions of the load forecast. Who do you want to bear the risk of that load forecast being wrong? Is it the generator? Is it Arnie's company? Is it Marji's company? Is it Travis's company? Or is it the average day consumer? And a lot of the options on the table, including utility rate-based build, that squarely puts the risk onto consumers. And then you're going to be paying off that risk for the next 30 years. So we're talking about potentially binding customers into the 2060s when you just don't have to. You should let the competitive market sift through all that.
It's also weird that you've got this dynamic where people are pointing to demand growth that's happening in one segment of this market, data centers. And that's, of course, the issue that is driving prices higher. So they're the ones, in a sense, causing that effect. But the regulated utility solution would be to build and rate-based generation that would be paid for by everyone in order to prevent that harm. Basically, they're, rather than avoiding the harm, they're sort of fast-forwarding to achieving it by rate-based generation. And that's a paradox, and not one that utility generation ownership proposals have really grappled with in any logical way.
Recent media coverage has really zeroed in on the most recent couple of capacity auction results, and to borrow a phrase that's been used, record high prices as a driver of consumer bills. And certainly that has sharpened the focus of the political folks in PJM as well as the regulators, of course. I guess the question people are asking at the highest level before we drill down is, are markets actually actually working as intended, or do they need some kind of reform to better reflect the cost implications to consumers versus the investment criteria needed for new resource deployment?
Well, Todd, maybe just taking a look first at the consumer angle. I mean,
Sure.
It is true for customers who are exposed to the spot price of capacity that those capacity costs have gone up, and that shows up in higher bills. But it is important to put that into the broader context. I was looking at some data from PSEG in New Jersey, and for the customers we serve there, capacity costs make up about 20 to 30% of our supply charges. And supply charges, as you know, are just one part of a customer's bill. Let's call it about half of a customer's bill. So realistically, even with these high prices of capacity baked in, they really do only account for about 10 to 15% of customers' bills. And let's just say the bills that customers have seen and the price increases are by and large not related to increases in that capacity price over time. It tends to be, in fact, more related to regulated utility spending in poles and wires, as well as the public policy surcharges, things like renewable energy programs, energy efficiency programs, that over time have driven these bills up. There's a lot going on, but it's first helpful to put into context what's actually going on in consumers' bills.
And Todd, I'll just say, based on the number of conversations we're having, the other side of that market working response is customers, especially large customers, coming to suppliers and asking about the ability to both support existing resources that could be in jeopardy or develop new resources. And I think one thing we need to remind ourselves of is that the auctions that preceded the two with quote unquote record high prices had record low prices. And that first auction that popped happened right after 6,000 megawatts of generation left the market. So there was a rational response to very low prices, and there is a very rational response to high prices. And we're having a bunch of conversations and we're doing a bunch of things ourselves that respond when the price signals tell us that we need to respond.
I would add that there have been policy goals that have very strongly impacted the wholesale market. And frankly, we weren't really taking account of them. And PJM became concerned that we weren't valuing the contribution of various resources. A lot of money was spent on renewable clean resources, but at the end of the day, many of them can't be depended on to keep the lights on for 24 hours. So part of the rising costs is to assure that as the states pursue their policy goals, that we maintain a reliable PJM. And in turn, that is causing some states to lean on other states, and how that's impacting cost is probably going to play out because some states have a more diverse portfolio and are not leaning on the system, while other states are very much depending on other states to carry their load during periods of shortage.
One thing I'll add to Todd, and I'm the one person on here who isn't in a company, so the folks you have on this call are the real experts in advising their companies. But I just feel like we're at the beginning edges of a real build out here in PJM and probably even in the country. And you can see all like the leading indicators. So there have been higher prices. I mean, that will certainly get the attention of anybody looking to develop. You look at the turbine manufacturers, they're doubling, in some cases tripling their capacity to manufacture. You're seeing states talk about what they can do to make permitting decisions faster. I mean, that's red and blue states. We're having conversations at the state level that we've never had before in recognition of the fact that energy capacity is needed. States that were looking to retire resources are at least starting to talk about the idea that these resources need to stick around. So I think there's a growing recognition that we've gone into a period where more energy is going to be needed, and the affordability of that energy is very, very important to voters. I'm here in the Philadelphia area, and there's a gubernatorial campaign going on across the river in New Jersey. I can watch a football game on a Sunday afternoon and see at least 24 ads about utility costs in my area. And that didn't happen before. So I think, like I said, there's early indications that we're really on the cusp of a major build out here. And as Marji pointed to the RRI numbers, my rough figures, there's been 7 gigawatts of announcements separate and apart from that RRI. So I think we're really seeing some signs that we're going to see some pretty significant investments coming here soon.
I think that's an important data point that you've raised, Glenn, and really everyone on the conversation here. We did a little work a few months ago now because the narrative had really tried to be established that generation costs and capacity in particular were driving up customers' costs. Bills were going up, and I'll borrow a quote again, 1,000%, which was never the case. But that was the way it was being framed by folks who had perhaps an interest in getting back into the generation game and didn't want to draw attention to where some of the costs actually were being created for customers' bills. So we retained Energy Tariff Experts, a firm that does tariff analysis, to do some work for us. And they did some analysis across the PJM footprint at utility service territories in a number of states. And a couple of things became pretty clear. The first of which is, even with the higher capacity clears, the generation component, which includes both capacity and energy, had remained flat to declining over the last 10 to 15 years in virtually every service territory. While I think, as you noted, Travis, the wires charges had gone up, and Marji, you've referenced state policy a couple of times, that they had resulted in increases to consumers' bills. And we didn't do the research in an effort to point fingers or to accuse, because there are investments that need to be made to ensure a reliable system. But it was more designed to try and push back on a false narrative that somehow this one auction, or now a couple of auctions, is what is driving consumer cost increases over the last decade. And so I'm curious, you all have been part of some of the discussions around these issues, and this issue came up a bit at the governor's conversation last week. Do you have any other takeaways that you get out of the findings that report uncovered, or how come that part of the discussion isn't really breaking through the conversation? Why is it so easy to just say, generation is driving up costs, when the data, frankly, doesn't support that anywhere?
Todd, I think there's a pretty easy response, which is T&D costs the states have been responsible for, and capacity and energy PJM has been responsible for. And I'm a little disappointed sometimes that our discussions have so much less to do with facts and a lot to do with rhetoric. And I think the problem is we're in a highly politicized environment. And so it's just very easy to point your finger at this third party. It is for PJM's for profit, but it really operates in a nonprofit way. Yeah. And it's just so easy to blame them instead of looking at themselves and saying, geez, what did I do here to help contribute to these higher costs? And that's why I think we have to go back to a partnership where everybody takes responsibility for what's within their jurisdiction.
Yeah, and it's sort of like the old adage about the frog and gradually warming water. The frog doesn't ultimately know that it's going to boil, and that's kind of what happens to transmission and distribution charges. They tend to move in one direction, up, as the revenue requirement increases over time. And that's not a competitive market where scarcity or oversupply causes a marginal price signal that will sometimes be very high and then be worked off and go very low the next year. So a very different dynamic. The way competitive markets are supposed to function with that marginal cost price signal is to convey not only a spot price on the margin, but also to kind of scare people into getting themselves hedged and entering into longer term, more stably priced contracts. But that is certainly not something we've seen in the regulated charges, which have been monodirectional up. And to make matters even worse, and to kind of Marji's point, I think there's a very real question about whether these, in some sense, there is even a regulator for a lot of these costs in any meaningful way. When you look at the way transmission is constructed and its costs are recovered from consumers in PJM, an awful lot of it comes through one-off supplemental projects that are proposed by transmission utilities, more or less rubber-stamped in the sleepiest of PJM stakeholder committees, and then pass through in FERC formula rates with little to no meaningful regulatory process. Candidly, if even 10% of the attention that's currently being paid to capacity markets were focused on these supposedly regulated charges, I think we'd be probably in a better place for consumers.
Piggybacking on that, I think to your question, Todd, it is about the suddenness of the capacity market increases. And I mean, to Arnie's point that he made earlier, those prices were very, very low for 3 years. They gave a retirement signal, and people did exactly what the market was telling them to do. And then just, at least for capacity market purposes, almost overnight, things change very quickly. The playbook for regulated water companies is to come in every year and a half and ask for an 8% increase and get a 5 or 6% increase. But they do it gradually, they do it regularly. And I would argue over time, consumers probably pay more if we look at that model on the electricity side. If prices would have been $200 for the last 10 years, would we have the outrage? I don't know about that, but I do know consumers would have been paying more over that time period.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. We appreciate that, Glenn. So there's obviously the 800-pound gorilla, perhaps, that we haven't talked about yet is the political intervention and the desire for many to keep politics as far afield from what is inherently becoming more and more political environment. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of political intervention? Do you view it as damaging? Do you view it as potentially helpful? Does it actually worsen volatility if politicians, I don't care what color, what stripe, what political party, doesn't matter, but if they're putting their thumb on the scale, does that make it difficult for you to invest in the projects that we know that we'll need over time for reliability, for new supply, for retention of existing resources?
It certainly doesn't help that the investment community sees all this uncertainty. And we did see PJM respond to a number of these policy requests. And that's how we got to very low prices and generators exited the system. We would argue those regulatory interventions were bad, although we couldn't have nonetheless predicted the AI growth. It doesn't help to have regulatory intervention, but at the same time, it is important that we be mindful in the wholesale market of the fact that politics is inescapable and that there will always be cost allocation issues. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be a balance. But I would reiterate, my company finds this kind of political intervention very challenging.
Yeah, Todd, I completely agree with that. I know when I talk to Vistra's board, the regulatory risk is the risk that feels the hardest to manage, because with commercial risk, there's usually some action we can take that will mitigate that risk. With political or regulatory risk, all you can do is hire the very best regulatory team you possibly can and hope for the best. And I'll say, I think in the most recent past, to Marji's points, there's always going to be a political element to the way decisions are made and how markets get designed. That's where we need a federal regulator that stands up to a set of principles, not in a pointy-headed bureaucratic way that ignores political realities, but in a long-term way that says, these are the principles by which we're going to make decisions. And we're going to stand up for those principles and make the hard decision, and sometimes the very unpopular decision, and the decision that's going to get them some political heat. And when they don't do that, then everyone along the chain has a harder time also standing up to political pressure. And I go back to the decision in the DPL South case where PJM believed there was a mistake. It was, in fact, exactly the way their market was designed to run. And FERC intervened to say, yeah, it's okay. We will change a market after it's run. And that one decision, I think, undermined confidence that FERC, our federal regulator, would kind of hold the line and stand up for its principles.
And obviously, investment in new generation is predicated upon some kind of longer-term revenue stability in order to get that capital in the ground. And that'll have to come from bilateral contracts or some kind of hedges off of that. But you've really increased the risk in PJM over time that longer-term contracts will have the value of their bargain eroded by political interventions. I mean, counterparties are more willing to enter into those long-term deals if the underlying market structure against which the deal settles is consistently defined. Like Arnie is saying, nearly all of these commercial contracts have change in law provisions, and the Commission and PJM are constantly changing the rules. And now governors want to always change the rules. So customers can then either find themselves paying a significant risk premium that encompasses that regulatory uncertainty, or alternatively, they can pay a lower price that includes that contract with change in law provisions, but that'll be invoked when PJM and the Commission once again change the rules. So naturally, a lot of this bilateral contracting has diminished. And what that means is probably less of a willingness to make, or a less stable environment to make generation investments potentially in PJM. And it also injects, frankly, a negative feedback loop. Many of the changes to the PJM market are precipitated by buyers or even sellers who are unhappy with their exposure to the single auction spot price outcome. Bilateral contracting would avoid that exposure, but then again, such contracting is going to be less likely to occur because there are more and more political interventions. So a vicious cycle has started, and it almost needs either the kind of vision thing that Arnie has described or some other policy that needs to be found in order to right this market.
So, Glenn, let me turn to you because your conference comments made a point to stress that PJM's capacity construct is still the best tool in the toolbox if it's left in a way to operate stably. I'll let you define that. Do you think some of the discussion around the governor's proposals or the addition of perhaps additional political implications undermines that stability? Or is that political dialogue maybe the impetus we need to work on making the changes that would help give stability to that capacity market construct?
So, in general, I feel like the conversations are changing at the state level. You'd walk through the halls of a General Assembly 5 or 6 years ago, and folks weren't concerned necessarily about reliability. PJM had 28% reserve margins, prices were low, everything was going great. In fact, most of the conversations were about how can we retire some of the assets that we think are some of the dirtier assets out there. That has very much changed at the state level. I don't think there's really a policymaker out there in this space that doesn't believe we need more megawatts on the system. And more importantly, and maybe somewhat ironically, there's a strong desire, regardless of where on this political spectrum you stand, to retain the existing assets. So, quarters you would never have thought about recognize the need to keep what's on the system there. And in my ideal world, that should continue in good times and bad, so to speak, that every policymaker should be asking themselves when they think about a regulation or policy, what does this do to reliability? What does this do to affordability? So, and like I said, I feel like that message is permeating. I also feel like there is a growing recognition that quote unquote intervention is not a healthy or desirable thing. That said, I think the governors also want to see a little bit more accountability. I think they want to see a little bit more, visibility into the PJM process and how it works. And I think that's going to take a little bit of time. These markets are not necessarily easy things to pick up on. And it's going to take some time to appreciate the role that PJM plays here.
Does the political intervention spur more stability, or does it lead to more instability depending on the outcome?
The one good thing I would say is I've yet to hear a governor or even a state commissioner stand up and say, let's get rid of the capacity markets.
Yeah.
And there's been plenty of opportunities to do so, right? FERC had a technical conference in June, and I don't recall anybody standing up and doing it, probably much to the chairman's chagrin at the time, because, Chairman Christie was pretty transparent in his views that he didn't necessarily think that the capacity construct was the right way to go. So to that extent, I think that's positive. I think nobody will necessarily say that a 9-fold increase in capacity prices is a good thing.
Sure.
I would say that's not a good thing. It's tough to defend that kind of market, but the idea that we need a capacity construct as part of a properly designed and well-functioning market, I think is accepted. And the question is getting some stability to that mechanism. And obviously, political intervention can undermine that. But I think it's a two-way street. And I think the markets have to give the policymakers confidence as well.
Hey, Marji, you mentioned a couple of things in your comments about tinkering with markets often causes more harm than good. Are there a couple smarter reforms that you think people should focus on instead?
Yeah, I think many of us are thinking that we need to encourage PJM to find ways to continue to speed the interconnection process for large load if they show up with their own new generation. That could really help. Clearly, everybody's talked about load forecasting, which
Sure.
is probably the biggest challenge. And there are other things that we can talk about. None of us like the administrative aspects of the market, but for example, there is a backstop mechanism in PJM, and that is only if we have 3 failed auctions, which we're in really bad shape if that happens.
Right.
So we might want to look at that and see if we can change that. Also, price locks for new generation. It's controversial and we'd have to think about it, but it certainly helps to incent investment. So those are some of the things. And also, frankly, outside of the capacity market, there's still a lot of work to be done. We don't have gas and electric coordination where we'd like to see it be. We still have concerns with sometimes the disconnect between operations and markets, which is operators act very conservatively. And so right when you want the price signal to be in the energy market to be going higher to show scarcity, the operators take actions to mute that signal. And so we think there's room there as well. So we're all focused on the capacity market, but we can all keep enhancing the rules. Of course, that balances the challenge of not changing everything so often, but focusing on what can be enhanced.
Thanks, Marji. Travis, you talked about bilaterals and longer-term contracting to reduce reliance on spot prices. Is that a realistic policy response to governors' affordability concerns?
I think it should be, and it's something that consumers themselves in a majority of PJM states can take action around right now. I mean, I offer myself as a personal example. Last year I signed a 5-year fixed rate deal for my power supply. And so frankly, whatever happens to the capacity markets going up, going down, it's not going to affect my retail rate. And it's a shame that more people are not, both customers, small and large, are not on contracts like that. It affords stability for their bills, and upstream it provides a more stable source of revenue so that people can make investments in generation. I mean, the seminal question is whether the way the spot price is supposed to work is it's supposed to send a sometimes volatile signal to encourage consumers and to encourage generators to hedge the risk of that volatility by entering into these long-term agreements. And if you don't have a sufficient encouragement to do that, or a policy that requires it, then you end up having to make changes to the spot market that diminish the strength of that marginal cost signal. You end up doing things like having to mute the signal, but then over procure capacity. Whereas right now we're trying to run a fairly tight ship in PJM, which has 160,000 megawatts of load and generation. And the difference between the floor and the ceiling on that spot price is only a few thousand megawatts. We can either do this through a more relaxed, which is to say sometimes bloated administrative design, or we can have a competitive market that's working as it should, which in all the other commodity markets is framed as trying to encourage people to not be so exposed to the spot price in order to get better capital formation through bilateral longer-term contracts.
Thanks, Travis. Arnie, I'm going to come to you because the issue that's really been driving a lot of this discussion and the big storyline at the summit was the demand growth that's coming from AI and data centers, and really the uncertainty around how big that problem that we're trying to solve is. I know we've kind of talked about it a little bit already. Power futures aren't signaling that we're seeing growth at the pace and tenor that perhaps some of the rhetoric is suggesting. So I'm curious if you have thoughts in your view about just how much and just how soon we think some of this load will appear, and what are your concerns with some of the projections on what we think we're going to see and when we think we might see it?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I think there's a growing body of work, including some work that Vistra has done internally with a consultant, that starts with a top-down demand forecast. So there are a number of things that constrain the amount of load growth that we're going to get from AI and from data centers. There is the availability of new chips. There is just the CapEx spending that goes into building these data centers. A gigawatt data center costs $40 billion. So the kind of demand growth we're talking about is trillions of dollars of CapEx spending. And then there's just the time and effort it takes to just build these facilities, which you can track and vendors do track. And if you use those factors and do a top-down load forecast, you can get numbers. And again, there's a range and you see different numbers from different consultants, but it's somewhere on the order of, say, 60 gigawatts of demand growth for the United States by 2030. And when you allocate that across regions, for a region like PJM, using a variety of measures of PJM retaining its market share, you get demand growth on the order of 22 gigawatts to 26 gigawatts by 2030. That's still very significant, but it's much lower than PJM's 30 gigawatts. And I think importantly, it's substantially lower than the numbers you would get if you just added up what each utility in PJM said it was going to get in terms of new data center growth. And I think what makes all of this really hard is the really high numbers freak policymakers out and make them think that they've got to throw out market designs that have worked for years and years and years. And they're so uncertain and so unrealistic that the forward market doesn't know what to believe and probably underestimates demand growth. So you're kind of getting the worst of both worlds.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you raised that, Arnie, because one of the questions that we hear a lot is we don't know what the load forecast is, or we're not sure what we're aiming at, but we know we have to get there because we don't want to have a shortfall. We'd all agree with that. But a Rocky Mountain Institute study that was published years ago now highlights that even 1% in overestimated load forecast each year would translate into spending billions on power resources that may not be needed. And I think that's instructive for how policymakers may want to think about calibrating expectations. And Marji, you pointed out a couple of times now about load forecasting lacking consistency and credibility. Do you have reforms that you think would give investors in states more confidence? Can you tick off 2 or 3 things that you think are top of mind?
I think the question is, does PJM have the capability? Do they need to hire an independent third party? Do states themselves need to look at what the transmission utilities are telling them? We have to remember that it is in the transmission utilities' interest to inflate those numbers because it does go into rate base. And there could be other things too. You could have deposits, right? Security and collateral. Some of the states, Ohio and Indiana, have done that on a transmission basis, but maybe there's creative ways where PJM can do it on a capacity basis as well, so that at least entities are willing to put their money where their mouth is. And then if they don't show up, there is some money that can be allocated back to consumers or something like that. So it's an interesting one because both the state has some control over what it could charge data centers, but it's an interesting exercise, I think, to think about whether PJM too could impose milestones on interconnecting load.
Yeah. Glenn, you have thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Marji just said. Maybe just put a finer point on it. I mean, Todd, you used to be chairman of a public utility commission. I was as well. Travis was a public utility commissioner. I mean, I think this is something where the state public utilities could be working very closely with their utilities, auditing what is being submitted to PJM to make sure that whatever is being submitted to PJM, which is being baked into the load forecast, which is then used to set the reliability requirement, which is then used to develop the capacity charges, so that all those things line up. And there's absolutely a role for state commissions to play here so that at the end of the day, everybody has confidence in those load forecasts, because state commissions are really uniquely positioned here to be able to review confidential data, to get into the weeds and really audit what the utilities are submitting to PJM here.
Yeah. Travis?
Yeah, it's worth noting that utilities in PJM have not been great oftentimes at load forecasting historically. I mean, as part of research we did in Virginia, we went back and looked at every Dominion integrated resource plan to understand how 6 years out of the plan being submitted to their commission, they were right or they were wrong about the load forecast. And they were consistently wrong. They were wrong on an average of 12.5% error, again, just 6 years out of their forecast. And all of those IRPs were before data center growth had really taken off like a rocket, which just further magnifies both the uncertainty as well as the numbers, the size of the numbers in question. So when you do the math, a wrong forecast like that, if it finds its way into the actual capital a regulated utility is spending, that goes into its rate base. So that has easily implications of thousands and thousands of dollars per residential customer. So it's not only about getting better at reading the magic ball, which is a very hard thing to do, but something that state utility commissions need to take seriously. It's about making sure that for supply agreements, that the risk of load forecasting is owned by competitive suppliers and customers, because that's an easy way to cordon off that risk when you have two parties, neither of which has recourse to a captive base of consumers. And then for all the regulated grid costs, that's a more challenging thing to get at, because there you're talking about long range and even more uncertain load forecasts being the premise under which huge investments in transmission and distribution rate base are made, which will one way or another be recovered from whatever consumers happen to be on that grid. So again, I think that latter thing is actually in some sense the more important customer affordability and risk issue, even though is not right in front of the headlights right now because capacity markets are.
There was a lot of talk about governance and institutional reform, and there was talk about creating a new governors collaborative within PJM and what that might do, positive or negative. So would that actually improve accountability, or does it add more red tape? Is there possible benefits, or how do you see this as somebody that was in the room where it happens, so to speak, for the Hamilton fans out there when this whole PJM process got started?
Yeah, and that movie didn't end well for Hamilton, as I remember.
That's correct.
But with that said, At a very high level, having governor's office engagement in the PJM world is a positive thing. Having governors that know and understand what PJM is and does and can appreciate the value that PJM provides on a daily and yearly and historical basis, I view as a positive thing. I don't believe creating an organization to replace or supplement OPSI is a good thing. And I don't think the governors are headed in that direction. So I think that's positive. I just think state commissions as a general proposition are better positioned to stay in tune with these issues. They have the engineers, they have the economists, and more importantly, they have the institutional knowledge, because there's a long learning curve on these issues, and having an institutional expertise in state government is better situated in a public utility commission than in a governor's office. I also think it'll reduce the likelihood of governors taking pot shots at PJM and maybe being a little bit more careful with their intervention and accusations toward PJM. So that said, I think from what I understand of the collaborative and where it's headed, it's going to continue to be a forum for governors and their staff to talk about PJM issues. I look forward to engaging in those discussions. Selfishly, it's very helpful to me to have all 13 governors and the DC in a single room. It cuts down on my travel time, so I appreciate the ability to talk to folks in that setting. I thought it was great to be able to do that last week, and I look forward to doing it in the future.
Thanks, Glenn. I think that's super helpful. So to the stakeholders that are with me, the board turnover and leadership changes that are already underway at PJM, and now, of course, conversations around governance, what kind of governance reform do you think is useful or needed to balance state input and market stability so you can do the things you do and make informed decisions about investments that you'll make?
I have a very strong feeling about this. First of all,
Marji, go ahead.
I think our new board members are terrific. So I am so excited about that. They understand, they're engaged, and they come from a wide perspective. We have Matt Nelson, who is a state commissioner in New England, and we've got a former market monitor and a professor. So I'm really positive on that. What I would like to see is that, frankly, the model was mentioned. I really like the NESCO model in New England because it's about trust. The governors nominate people to that committee, and it's people who work for them and then report back to them on the issues. We heard a lot about trust at the Constitution Center, so we need to find a way to build up the governor's trust. At the same time, this organization needs somebody representing them in the stakeholder process who really does understand these details. It's very complicated, and so can work with the stakeholders and then work with this organization to try and produce the best outcomes.
Thanks, Marji. All right. So as we come to the end of our conversation, it seems appropriate for us to have some next steps. So what are some practical steps that PJM, states, and policymakers can take right now to ease affordability concerns and ensure a strong and reliable system? Consider this a speed round, if that's easier, to help you formulate your answer.
I'll start. I think, again, these markets have worked very well for a long period of time, both the energy market and the capacity market. And our history is we allow them to evolve as we identify issues that we need to address. I think near term, a little bit more focus on the energy market, which generally works very well, but still does not always reflect like the value of fuel on a cold winter weekend in the energy price is something that we could spend some more time on, so that the energy market's doing a little bit more work and the capacity market is doing a little less work. So that's probably something like reserve, ancillary service, reserve product changes. I think the other thing, and we talked about this as well, is we do need to do some reforms on the interconnection side. If we want markets to work, and we all do, part of that is making it as easy as possible for new resources to enter the market. The reforms that FERC did in Order 2023, I think were well-intentioned and thoughtful. I don't know whether the cluster study for interconnection is really the long-term solution. So I think a thoughtful reform to the generation interconnection so resource owners can respond as quickly as possible is also probably in line.
Yeah, and I'll double down on Arnie's comment there, especially since it's fresh in mind. I just co-authored a paper with the Colorado PUC chairman, Eric Blank, on generator interconnection. And I guess put in the simplest possible terms, if a competitive load serving entity has a contract with a data center that's long-term bilateral contract predicated on new generation investment, that generation should just be very top of the interconnection queue. It clearly has strong demonstrable commercial interest, and more to the point, there should be some alignment alignment on the state and electric distribution company side to allow that load to move in rough tandem with the addition of generation. To the degree that people are having a public policy concern about data centers coming online, rising prices, at least we should facilitate those data centers who want to make investments in additionality to come into the system nimbly in order to tamp down that concern and essentially accept a direct allocation of the costs of additionality onto their own shoulders. So let's remove the barriers there.
I'll pile on with an agreement with everything that Travis and Arnie said. The other thing I think PJM can do is really look at its demand response programs. We know that some data center owners have announced that they have flexibility, but we need to get the markets right so they are rewarded for that flexibility. And that will also help manage what we need going forward.
So, Todd, I'm going to take the spirit of your question and ask myself a different question.
Okay, sounds like a recovering politician, but all right.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask myself, if I had 30 seconds to talk to a governor, what advice would I give him or her? And the advice would be this: just be patient. Allow these markets to work and don't do anything stupid, because this is a moment where and I know that's hard to do in the face of political pressure due to rising costs that are hitting consumers' bills. And I fully expect or appreciate that there's enormous political pressure to do something because consumers are feeling the pain of increased costs. I totally get that. But I feel like we're at the cusp of a tremendous build out in generation in this space. I feel like there's a lot of risks associated with the load forecast. I feel that this is a problem that the markets can solve, and I think the states will be rewarded for their patience here, and they will be punished if they try to go either outside the market or do something rash that's going to be disruptive to a market that is really well positioned to address these challenges. So that would be my 30 seconds of advice to any governor in the PJM footprint.
And Glenn, that is an excellent way for us to close. So I want to take a moment to thank Glen Thomas, Arnie Quinn, Marji Phillips, and Travis Kavulla, all of whom were panelists at the PJM Governors Confab last week in Philadelphia, for sharing some insights from their both comments at the conference, but also their insights from coming away from the conference with our list of to-dos. And we're certainly appreciative of that. And we know that this is probably not the end of this conversation, but just the next step. So thanks very much for joining us today. And we look forward to an extended conversation over the coming months. The PJM Governors Conference highlighted where pressure is facing the grid, including rising demand, political scrutiny, and questions about whether or not the markets are working. States, PJM, federal regulators, and competitive suppliers all have a role to play in ensuring reliability without shifting risks unfairly to consumers. Striking the right balance is imperative. As our guests explain, there's no easy answer, but there are clear paths forward, like better load forecasting, smarter interconnection reforms, demand response, and appropriate collaboration between states, PJM, and competitive power suppliers. It's also critical to understand what drives prices customers see on their monthly utility bills and where supply costs sit historically in relation to other expenses like distribution, transmission, policy costs, and other utility spending. At the end of the day, price signals in the market are needed to spur investor action. They will rise and fall with supply and demand, providing greater efficiency and managing costs for consumers over the long run. Policy certainty is essential. Frequent rule changes, political interventions, auction timing changes, or moves towards re-regulation create uncertainty that slows investment just when it's needed most. Letting competitive markets work will be essential to providing the energy infrastructure that America needs. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about these issues and more on our website at EPSA.org, and follow us on social media on X at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. The music for this podcast is produced by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Be sure to subscribe and join us next time on Energy Solutions.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 175,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.